pleasure to have you here.
Okay, thank you.
And where do you come from? What was your background when you was young?
I grew up in Santa Barbara, California, and it was a small beach town, very much like Sarasota, where we are now. It was very quiet, the streets were empty at 9 o'clock. And one of the aspects of Santa Barbara was it had very large villas in a part of the town, which were built in the 1920s mostly, in a certain age of elegance. And many of these villas recalled either Moorish or Italian architecture, so it was part of my aesthetic upbringing that we had this patrimony of design. I chose something that neither of my parents did, because my father was a university professor in mathematics and biology, and my mother taught music. So that left me art, and that's what was interesting to me. In the time which I grew up in, art was not taken seriously. And so to decide to take art on as a career was maybe a more important decision or a more significant decision than it should ever be. But the culture of the time was such that art was not very important.
No, was the time of Woodstock, right? Of the hippies, and so the artists were seen
a little later. A little later. I grew up in the time of Haight-Ashbury and Woodstock. And my parents certainly experienced those times. I remember the riots when they burned the banks at my father's university in Isla Vista. So I was very involved in the 60s and in the mentality of the 60s. But it wasn't my personal motivation.
So becoming an artist wasn't like...
it wasn't a form of protest.
It wasn't a form of protest.
It was not a form of protest at all. I had no desire to protest anything. And my idea of becoming an artist was not at all in step with my time. I had a completely different idea of what it would mean to become an artist. In my time, it would have been considered that artists were pure and that they were supposed to express themselves. In 1970, that was considered what artists were supposed to do. I have never, ever had a relationship to art that was anywhere near that. 70s, our idea of art was to express yourself, which means to impose a vision of your personal idea of the world onto other people.
Why are you using impose and not express? Like, is that...
Because expressing your individuality is an imposition. And I absolutely believe this. I absolutely believe that it is a mistake in our time, the idea that artists express themselves. I don't agree with it. I never have agreed with it. And as I grow older, I continue to think it's a worse and worse idea. And for me, art is a way to understand the universe and understand and build a productive relationship with the universe. That's what art is to me. If you have a lover, and you say, our relationship is all about me, your relationship's not going to work very well. And so a human being can treat the universe as a lover or treat the universe as something he wants to impose his will upon. So that's the choice. But if you want to have a relationship with the universe, it's like you're sitting across the table from a beautiful woman. You ask her some questions. You understand what she's about. You don't say, I'm this and I'm that and I'm so cool and I'm so great. You know, that's not going to get you very far with a nice woman, and it's not going to get you very far with the universe.
And so you were talking about the universe, and I know that you had the first job that you had was to imagine the future of space trips for the NASA.
Right.
Can you tell us something about it?
Well, it was fairly formative, but the reason I got the job was because it went back very far in my life. It went back to when I was young, and my father, who was a scientist and mathematician, was not tremendously happy about me wanting to be an artist. And so he went and he found books of titles like The Mathematics of Art or The Geometry of Art and Life. And he would always just buy the books and just put them on my table. And he wouldn't expect much from me. But he would expect I'd read these books. And I did read the books. But the books didn't maybe do what he wanted to have happen, which was that I would take my interest in art and turn it into an interest in science or math. What they did instead was tell me that art and science and math, there's no difference between them. And so when I pursued art, my feeling was that art was not different than science and math, and that one should approach art the same way as science and math. What is science and math? It's a way to understand our world and where we are. Approach art as a way of understanding the world. It's really rather profound, because in most of Western history, art and science were not separated. They separated only in 1800, which is only 200 years ago. So you have to look at Western thought as starting with the ancient Egyptians. And so you have to say, well, okay, we have 4,000 years where art and science are hand in hand, and they decide to separate 200 years ago. So are we going to pay attention to the 200 years ago, or are we going to pay attention to the 4,000 to 6,000 years? That's what we want to know. And so I prefer to pay attention to the 4,000 to 6,000 years, because I think it was a mistake. It was a particular battle, theological battle, between the birth of the sciences and a crisis in the Catholic Church during the Inquisition. The sciences, as we know them today, were born in the Age of Reason. They were born under terrific pressure and a bad relationship with the Catholic Church. And so I feel that our time is still defined by this battle, especially in the United States. There is still very harsh battle between these two ideas of the world, these two ways of understanding the world. I think both ways are essentially wrong, and the way we can go forward is to finish this war and to find out what's really going on.
Sorry, I go back a second. The NASA.
Right.
Can you tell us something what he was doing?
Well,
I read that was like imagine future space trips. And
yeah, we don't realize it today, but until 1985, every space mission, every spacecraft was drawn by an artist. We drew, when I went into NASA, I could see in the files the drawings that were made for the Apollo mission to the moon. And they were made in ink using ruling pens on vellum. They were done in almost exactly precisely the same way that Borromini would have drawn a cathedral. Geometry and of technical design was continuous from ancient Egypt all the way to 1980. And we still had, I would open drawers and there were still all of the ruling pens and all of the mechanical things. You dip them in the ink and you draw your circle. I was the last person ever to draw. It's kind of like being the last person to do analog music. I got hired because I had this personal interest from my father in these crazy old books of geometry. So I had taught myself this skill. And they were very happy to get somebody who could draft these enormous visions of space and time.
What changed one day?
What changed one day is somebody brought in a big box and set it on the table and showed us the first ever computer graphic line drawing ever invented.
So
and this computer engineer said, in 5 to 10 years your job will be gone because this machine will be able to do what you do. And all the scientists laughed at him because they couldn't even imagine that this machine would do what I could do. But I kind of believed it. And so my two great loves were classical drawing and what I was doing at NASA. But I saw that what I was doing at NASA was actually threatened by this technology. And so it would be better for me before this threat took place to actually sell everything and take a plane to Rome.
You wanted a change also? Or?
Well, it's something I wanted to do because I got to a certain theory, which was I had studied classical drawing for a long, long time. There was a certain point where I got to where I couldn't do it in California, because there was a certain point in academic tradition where artists were sent to the Grand Prix de Rome, which meant they actually went to Rome and sat in front of the Greek and Roman sculptures and drew. And this was very important in the 1800s. It was essential to the training of the artist. And so it occurred to me that since we weren't drawing that well in our time, that this training, which was considered essential in the 1800s, even though we didn't know why it was essential, might actually be essential. So I thought the only thing I can do to find out the answer to this question is actually go to Rome, sit in the Villa Borghese with my drawing board and draw from those sculptures. And then I could find out whether it was essential or wasn't essential. You know, that was my experiment. I got on the plane, couldn't speak Italian, no idea about, I had never been to any country like to Italy. I'd been maybe 2 days in Mexico, but I'd never been really in a foreign country. I packed up everything, had my little backpack, I had a trunk, and I went to Rome. Poof.
So you was talking before about ancient time, Romance, Egyptian. You know, the Anamorphic is a very old,
yeah,
kind of
it's very old.
There are artists that.
Well, the big one was Andrea del Pozzo.
Andrea del Pozzo, yeah.
He was
massive.
He was a big one. Also intellectually, he was unbelievable.
So when did you came close to this technique? You started to elaborate. What did you add to it after?
Well, already in NASA, I was experimenting with very wide angles of view. Because when you have to do these vast planets and spacecraft, you're dealing with these spaces that are way beyond what we can comprehend. And it seemed to me that it was worthless to try to depict these spaces within the narrow range of, for instance, a 50mm lens. It was silly to do it. It's like you're looking, you know, it's like looking through a telescope. Well, I don't want to look through a telescope. I want to feel like you're there, and you're looking from the left to the right. So I was always interested in these very huge spaces and in how one could map them out. And since I always did this by myself, I came to some conclusions which ran contrary to how perspective is done. Because I did what Piero della Francesca did, which I mapped point by point what happens in an instance. So most people who learn perspective learn techniques and rules and things, but I really mapped geometrically what happened as a curve went very, very far into space. And it didn't match up with what was in the books, but it did match up with what Piero della Francesca found. So I became very interested in the discovery of perspective.
Okay, then you start to work on it while you was painting the sculpture and.
Yeah, then I go to Italy and I see Pozzo's work, and I see that I went up. I had a friend who was a restorer, and I was able to go up into the church ceilings and see how the things were painted. Yes. And I saw how anamorphic they were actually. So when you crawl up to the top, to the cornice of the church, to the what do we call the molding, they're very huge, and you can walk on them and you can see these frescoes as they were painted, and you see that, oh my, they weren't painted the way we think they were painted. They are actually distorted so they look good from the ground.
What's the first time that you decided to bring it to the street?
Well, it took me about a year or two, because the street was a completely different problem. Geometrically, it was a different problem. And because of my training, I was interested in solving the problem in a very rational manner. So I just didn't want to do it. I was really interested in how each point how somebody standing at a certain height at the base of the drawing would see each point as it came toward him. And that was it's a geometry that wasn't done even in the Baroque church ceilings. It was a brand new geometry, really.
But how this connection with the street, with the people, that you decided to show this?
Well, 1982 in Rome, I started doing what everybody else did, which was great for my own studies, which was copying masterpieces. That was just like you would have done in the 18th century, but I was in the street doing it. Mm-hmm. That worked really well. And then I copied all the masterpieces that I felt I wanted to copy. And I really didn't like the idea of looking at a piece and copying. In public. It just seemed like it wasn't a very interesting thing. So I got bored with that, and then I started just inventing pieces, but in a classical style. So I would invent a normal piece in a classical style, but then the people would come up and they'd say, well, you know, is this a Michelangelo? Is this a Caravaggio? Who did this?
It's a Kurt Wenner.
Yeah, it's a Kurt Wenner. And then I found out they didn't believe me at all. So, and some people would get quite upset with me. And I said, well, you can see I'm not using anything, I'm not looking at anything.
But there were columns,
There wasn't so much architecture. No, they were mostly figures at the time. I did Madonnas and I did saints and but they were, you know, I was just imagining them.
There was already the anamorphic things.
No, they weren't anamorphic at that point. It was bothered me that nobody could understand that my work was original. So I could, you know, I had succeeded in the sense that I was able to do the work like a Baroque artist or a Renaissance artist, but I'd failed in the sense that nobody could appreciate it.
So you had to put something.
So I had to figure out something. I had to figure out something that would make it clear that the works were my own.
That was the 3D perspective.
Well, I was also interested in 3D perspective, and then having photographed my own works, I also saw aspects of the works that looked quite three-dimensional because the chalks photographed really well. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, what if I really make a Andrea del Pozzo painting, but using the geometry of a person standing right there? And it wasn't clear to me that this would work, because the church ceilings, you know, you're looking at them from very, very far away. So your stereo vision is wiped out. After 20 feet, your stereo vision becomes very weak. So it's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to look up at a church ceiling and this wonderful thing's going to happen. It's another thing to say, I'm going to make this illusion happen from where a person is standing to 20 feet away. A very radical geometry. And I wasn't all sure it would work. And it took quite a few tries before I understood how I could do this and that it would work.
Can you explain first, very quickly, what is an anamorphic painting?
An anamorphic painting is a normal perspective that travels outside of a very narrow angle of view that we consider conventional. The first thing of any perspective is that it's made from one point in space. It's calculated from one point in space. So from that one point in space, you have the possibility that your angle of view is very narrow, and then you have conventional perspective. As you widen that perspective, the forms become anamorphic. That means that if you're trying to make a painting of a sphere is only a circle if you're looking straight at it on a flat surface.
But if you get the perspective,
the minute the sphere moves slightly from the center, correct geometry would tell you it's already an ellipse. It's only the sphere in the middle. And then, but there's a certain range where we accept it, which is about 60 degrees to 90 degrees. And you say, that's conventional, that's normal. You move out of 90-degree angle, and then you're into anamorphic perspective. Same geometry doesn't change.
So what a person is watching really from that point?
Well, you have to calculate. They're standing, they're 5 feet tall. So normal perspective can't be more than 4 or 5 feet away from them. If your drawing goes 15 feet away from them, it's automatically has to be anamorphic. It's just obvious. Because the angle of view goes outside of, when a person's looking at a picture on the floor, standing up, there would be a circle around them of about a diameter of 5 feet, and that's where things are relatively normal. The minute you move away from 5 feet, you're already into anamorphic perspective. It's just the way math is.
Okay, so bigger has to be the sphere that the person watches, and wider and bigger has to be.
It becomes an ellipse which is stretched out away from the viewer, the sphere.
Okay.
Most people don't understand this happens immediately, but we accept it until it's about 60 degrees, and then we don't like it anymore.
why with the photography it works better than with human eyes? The effect is much more three-dimensional.
Well, there's two reasons. The first reason is that you've closed one eye, so you don't have the stereoscopic. Stereoscopic tells you where the pavement is, and so that cancels the illusion.
2 points instead.
So if you look through a hole, it already is intensified. The second thing is depth of field. That we're not aware of it, but the human eye is very sensitive to how far something is, even one eye. So my eye here, if I have to focus on my finger here and I move it there, I have to refocus. Very sensitive. So one eye tells me, using one eye I can know if my eye is working well. I can know whether something's 5 feet away or 8 feet away or 10 feet away.
So 2 eyes are just trying to focus in different layers.
Well, 2 eyes give you stereoscopy, which is a huge, that's one clue. One eye gives you depth of field, which is another clue. The camera, you adjust your depth of field. It can be even very little or very big.
Yeah.
So once you make your camera see infinite depth of field, that clue is gone, and then you're only dealing with the image. Once you're only dealing with the image, the illusion's perfect.
We were talking about before your job at the NASA that you have to imagine the space and the future of the spaceship. Where do you see the future of street paintings now?
Well, you have to remember where I found street painting when I came to it. It was truly a beggar's art. There might have been 15 old street painters left in Italy. It was, even the national government in Italy considered it was going to die and disappear. So it was really on its last breaths. A lot of people like in Grazio or other places say, well, we need to preserve the old kind of street painting. That might be well and good, but it wasn't ever a reality. Because the reality of street painting, what made it beautiful was the relationship between the artist and the public. And for that relationship to remain beautiful, the dialogue between the artist and the public has to remain as it was 100 years ago. That's true, that's what you're trying to preserve. But the problem is the public has changed. So to have if the public changes and you want the relationship to be the same, you need the art to change. You can't have the same old art and new public and have the relationship be the same. And the art needs to in order for the art to have the same meaning, it needs to change.
Okay. We're in Sarasota now. It's becoming one of the biggest events now internationally of like the biggest meeting of street art. What would you like to say to the people to come and enjoy this experience with us?
Well, I think if you're fortunate enough to come and visit the festival at Sarasota, you probably don't have the possibility to understand how fortunate you are, because this kind of festival started probably in 1986, I think, when I started the first one in Santa Barbara. And I had a certain vision for these festivals which didn't manifest right away. It manifested into something that was successful and beautiful and ongoing, and I'm happy for that. But my vision for the festival was that people would be able to come and see pavement art at its best. That was my vision for Grazia in its day, and that was somewhat of a disappointment to me because they were too rigid in their organization. And it was the vision I had when I brought to Santa Barbara. But in that case, they had a business model which was quite different and ultimately limited artistically what one would see. Sarasota, what happens is that these other festivals in the US, they raise money for valuable arts programs. But their idea is to not pay the artists, to have the artists work, and then to make profit so they can fund these other art programs. Denise's idea is quite different. Her idea is to show pavement art at its most amazing. And so that was really what I felt should happen, way back in 1986, and didn't ultimately happen, and at which point I gave up and stopped doing it. And then when she invited me and I saw what she was doing, I had to finally dust myself off and say, okay, well, this is worth helping out with. But I think that citizens of Sarasota are lucky in the sense that she has provided a venue which tries its utmost to show the best artists doing their best work to the public.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kurt.
All right.
Pleasure to meet you.